A sailor stands on deck in the deep hours of night. The year is 1902. Lake Michigan stretches black and flat beneath a half moon, and ahead through the darkness he sees a schooner cutting through calm water, every sail visible and full, every porthole glowing with warm lamplight, a vessel moving with purpose and grace. He calls for the captain, turns to point at the ship, and when he looks back, the water ahead is empty, nothing but moonlight on gentle waves, the schooner gone as if it never existed. The Great Lakes produced more ghost ship stories than any waters in North America, not because of superstition, but because of what these lakes do to human perception and memory. Discover what sailors actually reported seeing. Understand how the lakes create visual confusion that tricks even experienced eyes, and learn why these stories spread and persisted across generations. Journey with me from the documented sightings through the science of perception on water into the psychology of pattern recognition, and finally to why these stories became permanent features of Great Lakes culture. Before we begin, settle into this journey wherever you are watching from. The stories you are about to hear are documented in ship logs, newspaper archives, Coast Guard reports, and the collected memories of communities that lived by shipping and fishing. These are not campfire tales whispered to frighten children. These are accounts given by professional sailors, by captains whose careers depended on accurate observation, by men who knew the difference between a real ship and empty water, yet who saw things that should not have been there and struggled to explain what their eyes reported. The Great Lakes are not oceans, but they behave like oceans in many ways. They generate their own weather systems. They produce waves that can reach 20 feet or higher. They stretch to horizons that curve beyond sight. Ships crossing Lake Superior or Lake Michigan can sail for hours without seeing land, surrounded only by water and sky, alone in a vast blue or gray expanse that feels as isolated as any ocean passage. But the Great Lakes also differ from oceans in crucial ways. They are freshwater, which affects how light behaves passing through it. They are colder than most ocean waters at similar latitudes, creating temperature differentials that produce specific atmospheric effects. They are contained, bounded by land, which means weather patterns circle back, fog banks persist, and conditions can change with shocking speed as air masses collide over relatively small areas. These differences matter. They create the conditions that generated ghost ship stories. They built the stage on which phantom vessels appeared to thousands of witnesses over nearly 2 centuries. And understanding these conditions is essential to understanding why the stories formed, why they spread, and why they persisted even as technology advanced and superstition supposedly faded. Let us begin with what people actually reported seeing. Let us examine the accounts themselves before we analyze what might have caused them. Because the reports follow patterns, they repeat details across time and space, and those patterns reveal something important about the nature of these sightings. Ghost ship stories on the Great Lakes typically begin the same way. A sailor on watch, often at night but sometimes in fog or heavy weather, sees lights where no lights should be, not random lights, ship lights. The specific configuration of navigation lights that every sailor knows: red and green running lights, white masthead lights, the warm glow of portholes. The lights move in ways that suggest a vessel under sail or steam, following a course, behaving as ships behave. Sometimes the sighting progresses beyond lights. The witness sees a silhouette, a hull shape, masts and rigging becoming visible as the phantom vessel draws closer or as atmospheric conditions momentarily clear. These silhouettes have detail. Witnesses describe the number of masts, the configuration of sails, the shape of the hull. Some reports include sounds, the creak of rigging, the splash of a bow cutting through water, even voices calling across the gap between ships. The phantom vessel moves correctly. This detail appears again and again in reports. The ghost ships do not drift randomly. They do not behave erratically. They follow shipping lanes. They navigate as if under intelligent command. They respond to wind and water in ways that suggest real ships obeying real physics. This realistic behavior makes the sightings more convincing, more disturbing, because there is no obvious wrongness, no immediate sign that what is being observed cannot be real. Then comes the vanishing. Sometimes gradual, the ship fading into fog or darkness as if sailing away. Sometimes instant, the vessel there one moment and gone the next, leaving the witness staring at empty water and questioning what they saw. And sometimes the vanishing occurs when someone else is called to confirm the sighting, the act of turning away or calling for another observer, breaking whatever fragile conditions allowed the phantom to be seen. These reports appear in records from the 1,850 seconds, from the 1,890 seconds, from the 1,920 seconds. They span different decades and different lakes, but the descriptions remain remarkably consistent. Lights, silhouettes, realistic movement, sudden vanishing, the pattern repeats with enough regularity to suggest that witnesses are describing a common experience, not inventing unique tales. Crucially, many of these reports come from experienced sailors. These were not tourists on pleasure cruises misidentifying distant boats. These were career merchant sailors, captains who had spent decades on the lakes, men who knew every vessel in the fleet by sight, whose livelihoods and safety depended on accurate observation of other ships and water conditions. When such men reported seeing phantom vessels, their accounts carried weight. They were trained observers who understood ships, who could distinguish between real vessels and unusual weather effects, who had no professional interest in being seen as superstitious or unreliable. Ship captains logged ghost ship sightings in official records. These logs were legal documents, evidence in disputes, records that could affect insurance claims and reputation. Captains did not log frivolous nonsense. If a sighting made it into an official ship's log, the captain considered it significant, worth documenting, worth the risk that others might question his judgment. The details in these reports are often specific. Witnesses describe seeing particular ships they recognize: a schooner with distinctive red paint on the hull, a steamer with a specific funnel configuration. Sometimes the ships are identified by name, vessels the witness knows from years of sharing the lakes. And sometimes, disturbingly, the ships that are seen are ships that are known to have sunk, vessels lost in storms years or even decades earlier, now apparently sailing again under full command. One of the most repeated sightings involves a ship called the Griffin. The Griffin was a small vessel built by French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, in 1679. It was one of the first European ships to sail the upper Great Lakes. In September 1679, the Griffin departed Washington Island in Lake Michigan, loaded with furs, headed back east, and vanished. No wreckage was ever conclusively identified. The ship and its crew simply disappeared into the lakes. And ever since, sailors have reported seeing the Griffin. Hundreds of reports over nearly 350 years describe a small vessel matching the Griffin's description, sailing alone, often seen near Washington Island or in northern Lake Michigan, appearing and then vanishing. The reports come from witnesses separated by generations, people who could not have coordinated their stories, yet they describe the same ship in the same areas doing the same things. This repetition is important. If ghost ship sightings were simply random hallucinations or inventions, we would expect random details, but instead we get patterns, the same ships reported by different witnesses, the same behaviors, the same locations where sightings concentrate. This consistency suggests that some combination of conditions or causes, produces experiences that multiple independent observers interpret in similar ways. The timing of these reports is also significant. The vast majority of classic ghost ship accounts come from the era before radio communication became standard on Great Lakes vessels. This matters because before radio, ships traveled in isolation once they left port. If a vessel encountered trouble between ports, if it sank or was disabled, other ships would not know. Days or weeks could pass before a missing ship was noticed. Search and rescue was often impossible because no one knew where to search. This uncertainty created a psychological environment where ghost ships made sense. Sailors knew that ships vanished. They knew that vessels they had seen sailing out of port might already be on the bottom of the lake even as they appeared to be making normal passage. The possibility that a ship seen on the horizon might be a phantom, might already be lost, was not ridiculous in this context. It was a genuine uncertainty, a question that could not be immediately answered by radio contact or transponder signals. So when sailors saw something strange, when they observed a vessel that did not behave quite right, or that vanished unexpectedly, their minds reached for an explanation that fit their experience and their era. Ghost ship. A vessel lost, but somehow still sailing. The idea was not supernatural in the way modern people think of ghosts. It was more like a glitch, a persistence, an echo of something that had been but should no longer be. Now we must turn from what people reported to why they reported it. We must examine the Great Lakes themselves and understand how these particular bodies of water create visual confusion, how they trick the eye and mind, how they generate experiences that even trained observers struggle to interpret correctly. Fog is the first factor, and on the Great Lakes, fog is not the thin mist of morning that burns off quickly. Great Lakes fog is a thick physical presence that reduces visibility to feet or yards, that turns the world into layers of gray where nothing has distance or solidity. Ships appear and disappear in fog like ghosts, not because they are supernatural, but because the fog creates pockets of visibility surrounded by blindness. Imagine standing on deck surrounded by fog so dense you cannot see the bow of your own ship. Then suddenly the fog thins slightly, just enough, and there is another vessel 50 yards away, appearing complete and solid out of nothing. For a moment you see it clearly. Then the fog closes again, and the ship is gone, swallowed as quickly as it appeared. You did not see it approach, you did not see it depart, it simply was, and then was not. This experience is not supernatural. It is a normal condition of sailing in Great Lakes fog. But to someone experiencing it, especially someone already primed by stories of ghost ships, the effect is indistinguishable from an encounter with a phantom. The ship appeared from nowhere, existed briefly, and vanished. That pattern matches every ghost ship story, and it happens constantly on the Great Lakes whenever heavy fog settles. Fog also removes depth perception. Human brains judge distance partly by seeing layers of detail, by comparing near and far objects, by using the graduation of clarity to construct a three-dimensional understanding of space. Fog eliminates these cues. Everything becomes flat, two-dimensional. A ship seen in fog has no clear distance markers. It could be 50 yards away, or 500. The brain struggles to place it in space, and that uncertainty makes the experience feel wrong, unusual, potentially supernatural. The Great Lakes themselves create additional visual confusion through their horizons. Unlike ocean sailing, where waves provide constant texture and scale reference, the Great Lakes can present perfectly flat horizons that look infinite. On calm days, the lake surface becomes a mirror reflecting sky. The boundary between water and air grows ambiguous. Ships on this mirror surface can appear to float in undefined space, disconnected from normal visual context. This effect is strongest on Lake Superior, the coldest and often the calmest of the Great Lakes. When Superior is truly calm, when wind dies and the vast surface flattens, sailors describe it as eerie, unsettling. The water looks solid, glassy, and distant ships appear to be hovering rather than floating, suspended in space rather than moving through water. This visual ambiguity makes ordinary vessels look extraordinary, and it makes judging their distance, speed, and even realness nearly impossible. Light behaves strangely over water. This is true on all bodies of water, but especially on the Great Lakes, where cold water temperatures and variable air temperatures create specific conditions. Light refracts as it passes through layers of air at different temperatures. Over cold water with warm air above, light bends in ways that distort images, that make distant objects appear closer, that create multiple images or elongate shapes vertically. Ship lights are particularly affected. The navigation lights of a distant vessel, small points of red, green, and white, refract through atmospheric layers and can appear much larger, much closer, and much brighter than they actually are. A ship 10 miles away might appear to be 2 miles away based on the brightness of its lights. When that ship then fails to arrive at the expected time, when it seems to vanish rather than passing as close as the light suggested, the observer is left confused, potentially interpreting the experience as a supernatural encounter rather than an optical distortion. Under certain conditions, ships cast perfect reflections on calm water. The reflection is not below the ship in the normal way. It is inverted and can appear separate, creating the visual impression of two vessels where only one exists. In fog or darkness, An observer might see this doubled image, see what appears to be two ships traveling together, and then as conditions change, as the reflection vanishes or the fog shifts, suddenly there is only one ship or no ship, and the observer is left trying to explain what happened to the second vessel. Temperature inversions over the Great Lakes create superior mirages, a phenomenon where light bends over cold water and warm air to project images of objects that are actually below the horizon, making them appear in the sky above their real location. This can make a distant ship appear to be floating in midair. It can make a vessel that is actually miles away and completely hidden by Earth's curvature suddenly appear as if by magic, hovering on the horizon, distorted and strange. Superior mirages can also create multiple images stacked vertically, showing the same ship 3 or 4 times in a column, each image slightly different as light refracts through different atmospheric layers. To an observer unfamiliar with this phenomenon, the sight would be bizarre, inexplicable, potentially terrifying. And even to someone who understood mirages, the effect would be disorienting enough to make accurate observation nearly impossible. These optical effects are not rare anomalies. They are regular features of Great Lakes sailing. They happen constantly whenever atmospheric conditions align, which on these cold waters with variable air temperatures is frequently. Sailors in the 19th and early 20th centuries encountered these effects regularly, but lacked the scientific framework to understand them. They saw distortions, multiplications, appearances, and vanishings, and they interpreted them through the frameworks available to them, which often meant ghost ships. Even familiar routes looked strange under different conditions. A shipping lane sailed hundreds of times would be unrecognizable in fog or under the distortion of superior mirages. Landmarks would vanish, islands would appear to move. The whole geography would seem wrong, alien, and in that disorientation, even experienced navigators questioned what they were seeing and whether the ship ahead was real or some trick of the lakes. Now we must turn to human psychology, to how the brain processes incomplete information, and to how expectation shapes perception. Because even with all the atmospheric and optical effects the Great Lakes produce, those effects alone do not fully explain ghost ship stories. We must also understand how human minds interpret what eyes report, and how that interpretation is shaped by context, expectation, and exhaustion. The Great Lakes shipping lanes were busy. In the peak decades of sail and early steam, hundreds of vessels worked the lakes simultaneously. A sailor on watch expected to see other ships. The brain was primed to recognize ship shapes, because ships were the most important thing to watch for, both as collision hazards and as signs of nearby help if needed. This expectation mattered because human visual processing does not simply record what the eyes see. It interprets, it fills gaps, it completes partial information based on what it expects to find. When a sailor looked into fog or darkness and saw a shape, a dark form on the horizon, or a set of lights in the distance, the brain immediately began processing that information through templates, through stored patterns of what ships look like. A few vertical lines became masts, a horizontal line became a hull. Scattered lights arranged themselves into the navigation light pattern every sailor knew by heart. The brain took incomplete data and constructed a complete ship from it, filling in details that might not have been actually visible. This is not hallucination. This is normal perceptual processing. Human brains do this constantly with all sensory information. We see fragments and construct wholes. We hear partial words and understand complete sentences. We feel textures and recognize objects. The brain is designed to complete patterns, to make sense of incomplete information, to construct coherent experience from fragmentary data. But this design feature can produce errors. When the incomplete information is ambiguous, when it could be interpreted in multiple ways, the brain chooses an interpretation based on expectation and context. A sailor expecting to see ships will construct ships from ambiguous data. The dark shape in the fog that might be a distant shoreline, a patch of different water, or simply a variation in the fog itself becomes a hull because the brain completes it as a whole. In darkness, this effect is even stronger. Human night vision is poor in detail. We see shapes and movements more than we see clear images. A set of lights moving across dark water is just lights until the brain interprets them as ship lights, and once that interpretation is made, the brain fills in the rest. The observer sees a complete ship even though the actual visual data consists only of scattered points of light moving in a pattern. Once the brain commits to an interpretation, confirming information is noticed, and contradicting information is dismissed or not noticed at all. This is confirmation bias, and it affects everyone regardless of training or experience. If the brain has decided the lights are a ship, then anything consistent with that interpretation is noticed. The lights move, of course they move. Ships move. The lights change position relative to each other. Of course, ships roll in waves, lights shift. The lights vanish. The ship must have sailed behind fog or into a dark patch of water. Alternative explanations: that the lights were reflections of stars on wavelets, that they were distant shore lights distorted by atmospheric refraction, that they were lanterns on fishing boats too small to see clearly. These alternatives are not considered once the brain has committed to the ship interpretation. Fatigue makes all of this worse. Sailors on night watch were often exhausted. Shifts lasted for hours. Cold, darkness, and the constant attention required to watch for hazards produced mental and physical fatigue that degraded perceptual accuracy. Exhausted brains are more likely to make pattern recognition errors. They are more likely to see shapes in random visual noise. They are more likely to construct complete images from incomplete data. They are more likely to commit to interpretations without sufficient evidence. And once one person reported a sighting, once one sailor said he saw a ship in the fog or the darkness, others became primed to see it too. This is social contagion of perception. If someone you trust says they see something, you become more likely to see it as well, because your brain is now primed with the expectation, with a suggested interpretation. Multiple witness sightings can arise this way without any intention to deceive. The first witness sees something ambiguous and interprets it as a ship. The second witness looks where indicated, sees something ambiguous in that area, and confirms the interpretation. Neither is lying. Both genuinely saw something. But what they saw might not have been a ship at all, just ambiguous data interpreted consistently because the interpretation was socially reinforced. The Griffin legend demonstrates this effect perfectly. The Griffin was the first major ship loss on the Great Lakes, the first mysterious vanishing that captured public attention. Once the story of the Griffin's disappearance spread, once it became known that this ship had vanished without trace, sailors began watching for it. They expected to see it. And expectation shapes perception. Any small vessel seen in northern Lake Michigan, any ambiguous sighting in fog or darkness, became a potential Griffin sighting. The expectation created a perceptual filter through which ambiguous stimuli were interpreted. Over decades and centuries, hundreds of witnesses reported seeing the Griffin. These reports came from people separated by generations, people who could not have coordinated their stories. But they did not need to coordinate because they shared the same expectation, the same interpretive framework. They all knew the Griffin's story. They all watched for the Griffin. And when they saw something ambiguous, something that could be interpreted as a small sailing vessel in the right area, their brains completed the pattern as the Griffin. This is not to say these witnesses were foolish or dishonest. They were experiencing normal human perception under conditions specifically designed to produce this kind of interpretive error. The Great Lakes provided ambiguous stimuli: fog, darkness, optical distortions. The cultural context provided an interpretive framework: ghost ships, particularly the Griffin. And human psychology did what it always does. It constructed coherent experience from fragmentary data using the templates and expectations available. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle. The Griffin was seen because people expected to see it. Each sighting reinforced the expectation for the next generation of sailors. The story spread and strengthened not because the Griffin was actually sailing the lakes as a phantom vessel, but because the conditions that produced the initial ambiguous sightings continued to exist, and the interpretive framework that explained those sightings as the Griffin persisted and strengthened through cultural transmission. Now we must ask why these stories did not fade. Why did ghost ship tales persist across generations? Why did they survive the transition from sail to steam, from steam to diesel, from the era before radio to the modern age of GPS and radar? What kept these stories alive when so much other maritime folklore faded and was forgotten? The answer lies in the structure of Great Lakes maritime communities and in the psychological needs these stories served. Ghost ship tales spread through specific networks and filled specific functions. They were not random superstitions. They were functional narratives that addressed real needs and real anxieties in the people who told and retold them. Port towns on the Great Lakes were tight communities where sailors from different vessels met regularly. Taverns, boarding houses, shipping offices, these were places where information spread rapidly. A sailor who had a strange experience on the water would tell the story at the tavern that night. Other sailors would hear it, would share their own similar experiences, and the stories would reinforce each other. By the next day, the account would have spread through the port. Within a week, sailors departing for other ports would carry the story with them, spreading it to new communities, where it would mix with local accounts and grow. This information network was oral, fast, and efficient. Stories that resonated, that captured something important or emotionally significant, spread farther and faster than mundane accounts. Ghost ship stories resonated. They touched on fears and mysteries that every sailor faced. They offered explanations for strange experiences that many had shared but struggled to understand. And they spread through the network, becoming part of the collective knowledge base of Great Lakes maritime culture. These stories also served a crucial psychological function. The Great Lakes were deadly. Thousands of sailors died in shipwrecks. Storms arose with shocking speed, turning calm water into killing seas in less than an hour. Ships vanished with all hands, often without any survivors to explain what happened. Entire crews were lost, leaving families without answers, without bodies to bury, without closure. Ghost ship stories provided a way to process this constant loss. If the dead were still sailing, if lost ships were still out there moving through fog and darkness, then death was not complete annihilation. It was transformation, continuation. The sailors who died were not simply gone. They were still on the water, still doing what they had always done. This was comforting in a way that might be hard for modern people to understand. It made death less absolute, less final. For communities that lived with constant maritime loss, that sent husbands and fathers and sons onto dangerous water knowing they might not return, ghost ship stories were a way of keeping the dead present, of maintaining connection. Seeing a phantom vessel was not frightening in this context. It was reassurance. The lost were still there. They had not vanished into nothing. They sailed on. Ghost ships also became a way to talk about danger without technical language. Before modern meteorology and ship design analysis, sailors lacked precise vocabulary to discuss why the Great Lakes were so deadly, why certain areas were more dangerous than others, why some ships survived storms while others sank. Ghost ship stories encoded this practical knowledge in narrative form. A particular stretch of water where many ships had been lost would accumulate ghost ship sightings. These sightings served as warnings. If you saw a ghost ship in that area, you knew you were in dangerous water. The story became a mnemonic device, a way to remember and communicate hazard information. New sailors learning the lakes would be told the ghost ship stories, and those stories would teach them which areas to fear, which conditions were most dangerous, which situations required extra caution. This was practical knowledge encoded in supernatural narrative because supernatural narrative was memorable and transmissible in a way that dry hazard reports were not. A story about seeing the phantom Griffin off Washington Island would be remembered and retold. A weather report about dangerous currents near Washington Island might be forgotten. The ghost story carried the practical information about danger in a form that stuck in memory and spread through the community. To those who worked the Great Lakes for years, the water itself felt alive. This was not superstition but experience. The lakes had moods. They changed unpredictably. Calm water could turn deadly in minutes. Fog appeared from nowhere. Weather came in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Sailors anthropomorphized the lakes because it helped them think about and predict behavior that was complex and partially chaotic. Ghost ships fit naturally into this worldview. If the lakes were alive, if they had agency and memory, then of course they would hold on to lost ships, would sometimes allow those ships to be seen again. Ghost vessels were part of the lake's consciousness, part of its mood, part of its character. This was not irrational belief. It was a metaphorical framework that helped sailors navigate genuine complexity and danger. Economic incentives also played a role in preserving ghost ship stories. Port towns discovered that these tales attracted attention. Newspapers printed ghost ship accounts because readers found them fascinating. These stories sold papers, drew tourists, gave communities distinctive identities. A town known for ghost ship sightings had a story to tell, a claim to uniqueness in a competitive shipping economy. Tour boats began offering ghost ship excursions. Hotels advertised their proximity to haunted waters. Local historians collected and published ghost ship accounts, creating books that were purchased by visitors and residents alike. The stories became economically valuable, which meant they were preserved and promoted even by people who did not necessarily believe them. This economic function meant that ghost ship stories received more attention and documentation than they might have otherwise. Accounts were written down, published, archived. This documentation created a permanent record that future generations could reference, which reinforced the stories further. The economic value of the tales ensured their survival in a way that purely oral tradition might not have. Each generation of sailors was told the ghost ship stories by the previous generation. These stories became part of training, part of initiation into maritime culture. New sailors learned the Griffin story, the legends of specific phantom vessels, the lore of particular haunted waters. This transmission created expectation. When these new sailors then had strange experiences on the water, when they saw something ambiguous in fog or darkness, they interpreted it through the framework they had been given. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of confirmation. The stories persisted because each generation experienced phenomena that seemed to confirm them. But the reason the phenomena seemed confirmatory was that the stories shaped interpretation. Ambiguous stimuli were interpreted as ghost ships because ghost ships were the available explanatory framework, and each such interpretation strengthened the framework for the next cycle. This is not fraud or delusion. This is how cultural knowledge transmits and reinforces itself. The stories contained useful information about Great Lakes dangers. They provided psychological comfort in the face of constant death and loss. They gave communities distinctive identity and economic value. They offered explanatory frameworks for genuinely strange experiences. And they persisted because they successfully filled all these functions across generations. Even into the modern era, even with radar, GPS, and radio communication, ghost ship stories continue because the fundamental conditions remain. The Great Lakes still produce fog that can hide and reveal vessels in ways that seem magical. Temperature inversions still create superior mirages that make distant ships appear as floating impossibilities. Human psychology still constructs complete images from incomplete data, still interprets ambiguous stimuli through expectation. Modern sailors, with all their technology, still sometimes see things they cannot immediately explain. A radar contact that vanishes. A visual sighting that does not correspond to any transponder signal. Lights in areas where no vessels should be. These experiences are less frequent now because technology provides more information, more ways to confirm or deny unusual observations. But they still occur, and when they do, the old stories provide ready interpretation. The ghost ships of the Great Lakes persist not because the lakes are haunted, but because they are perfect machines for generating these experiences. The geography, the weather, the optical phenomena, the human psychology, the cultural transmission, all of these factors combine to make ghost ship sightings not just possible, but inevitable. The stories came from the Great Lakes because the Great Lakes created conditions where the stories had to emerge. Consider what it means to sail these waters at night. You stand on deck in darkness, broken only by your own ship's lights and the stars above. The water around you is black, merging with the black sky at an invisible horizon. Cold wind off the lake carries spray and moisture, creating halos around lights, distorting distances. Fog patches drift past, reducing visibility to yards and then clearing suddenly. In this environment, every light is potentially a ship. Every dark shape is potentially a hull. Your eyes scan constantly, watching for navigation lights, watching for obstacles, watching for other vessels in your path. Your brain is primed, expecting to see ships because ships are both the threat and the salvation. the hazard to avoid, and the potential rescue if something goes wrong. Then you see something. Just a flicker at first. Lights that might be stars reflecting on wavelets, or might be navigation lights in the distance. You watch. The lights move, or seem to move, or maybe they were always there and you are the one moving past them. The motion is ambiguous. Your brain begins constructing an interpretation. Ship. Must be a ship. You can almost see the hole now, a darker patch of darkness that might be solid form. You call out to your watchmate. You point. You say there is a ship out there. Your watchmate looks and sees the lights too, sees the dark shape you have indicated, and confirms it. Yes, a ship. Definitely a ship. Two pairs of eyes are better than one. If you both see it, it must be real. But as you watch, the ship does not behave quite right. It does not get closer or farther. The lights do not change in brightness the way they should as distance changes. The shape remains ambiguous, never quite resolving into clear detail. You reach for binoculars to get a better view. You look through the lenses, searching for the ship, and it is not there. Just darkness, just water. The lights are gone, or were they ever there? The dark shape you saw is now obviously just a patch of fog or a shadow on the water from clouds passing over the moon. You lower the binoculars confused. Your watchmate is equally puzzled. You both saw it, you both confirmed it. But now it is not there, and looking back at the experience, you cannot quite reconstruct what you actually saw versus what you interpreted. The memory is already fuzzy, already shaped by the expectation and the interpretation. Was it a ghost ship? The term rises in your mind because you know the stories. Everyone who sails these lakes knows the stories. Could it have been one of the phantom vessels, one of the lost ships that sailors report seeing? The possibility is there, offered by the culture, available as an explanation for an experience that does not have an obvious, mundane interpretation. You might not report it as a ghost ship. You might tell yourself it was a trick of the light, a false sighting, something explainable if you had more information. But the experience stays with you. And when you are back in port, when someone mentions ghost ships in the tavern, you think about what you saw. You might mention it casually, describing the strange sighting without claiming it was supernatural. But the story enters the stream, becomes part of the ongoing narrative, reinforces the cultural knowledge that these things happen on the Great Lakes. Multiply this experience across thousands of sailors over hundreds of years. Some sightings are clearly mundane, identified eventually as normal ships or shoreline lights or known phenomena. But others remain ambiguous, unexplained, strange enough to stick in memory and strange enough to share. These are the sightings that become stories, that spread through the maritime community, that accumulate into the body of Great Lakes ghost ship lore. The pattern is self-sustaining because the conditions are self-sustaining. The Great Lakes do not change. They still produce fog, temperature inversions, optical distortions, all the atmospheric phenomena that create ambiguous visual experiences. Human psychology does not change. Brains still construct complete images from incomplete data, still interpret through expectation, still confirm interpretations through social reinforcement. The cultural transmission continues as new sailors learn the old stories and carry them forward. This is why ghost ship stories came from the Great Lakes in such numbers and with such persistence. Not because the Great Lakes are more haunted than other waters, but because the Great Lakes are more efficient at creating the conditions that produce ghost ship experiences. The combination of factors is unusually concentrated here. Cold water, warm air, heavy fog, flat horizons, busy shipping lanes, tight maritime communities, oral culture, economic incentives, and centuries of accumulated narrative that provides ready interpretation for ambiguous phenomena. Other bodies of water have some of these factors. Oceans have fog and optical distortions, rivers have busy traffic and maritime communities. But the Great Lakes have all these factors concentrated in an unusually powerful combination. The lakes are large enough to produce ocean-like conditions, but contained enough that stories spread rapidly through connected port communities. They are cold enough to generate persistent fog and temperature inversions, but busy enough that many witnesses are present to observe the resulting phenomena. They have history enough to accumulate powerful legends, but remain relevant enough that new sailors still learn those legends. The result is a system optimized for generating and preserving ghost ship stories. Every element reinforces every other element. The weather creates the phenomena, the psychology creates the interpretation. The culture creates the transmission, the economy creates the preservation, and the geography ties it all together, keeping the system contained and concentrated in these specific waters. Understanding this does not diminish the stories. It does not reduce them to fraud or simple error. It explains them as the natural product of systems interacting in predictable ways. The sailors who saw ghost ships were not lying. They were reporting genuine experiences, experiences shaped by real phenomena, even if those phenomena were not supernatural. The ghost ships were real in the sense that the experiences were real. What sailors saw, they saw. What they felt, they felt. The terror of seeing a ship vanish, the confusion of sighting a vessel that does not behave correctly, the eerie sensation of lights appearing where no lights should be, all of these experiences were genuine. They were produced by the interaction of atmospheric phenomena, human perception, and cultural framework, but they were not false or invented. And this is perhaps the deepest truth about Great Lakes ghost ship stories. They represent something authentic about what it means to sail these waters, to face their dangers, to exist in the uncertain space between the solid deck beneath your feet and the vast mysterious darkness that surrounds you at night on these inland seas. The ghost ships sail because the Great Lakes demand them. The combination of physical conditions and human psychology makes their appearance inevitable. They are not supernatural entities, but natural products of how these specific waters interact with human perception and culture. Understanding this makes the stories no less powerful. It only makes them more human, more connected to the real experience of the people who worked and died on these waters. The Great Lakes produced ghost ship stories because every factor necessary for such stories existed here in concentration. The weather to create ambiguity, the psychology to interpret it, the culture to transmit it, the community to preserve it, the geography to contain it all in a coherent system that has operated for centuries and continues to operate today. Sailors still see strange things on the Great Lakes. Modern technology reduces ambiguity but does not eliminate it. Radar contacts vanish. Visual sightings do not match electronic data. Lights appear in areas where navigation charts show no obstacles. These modern mysteries connect backward to the older stories, suggesting continuity, suggesting that whatever created the ghost ship phenomenon in the past is still present, still producing experiences that resist easy explanation. The stories remain because the Great Lakes remain. As long as people sail these waters, as long as fog rolls across their surfaces, as long as cold water meets warm air and creates the optical tricks that have confused observers for centuries, there will be sightings. There will be reports. There will be stories. The ghost ships are not going away. They are permanent features of the Great Lakes, as much a part of these waters as the waves and the weather. They are the inevitable product of geography, psychology, and culture interacting in ways that produce experiences that feel supernatural even when they are entirely natural. They are the stories that sailors tell because the lakes give them experiences that demand stories. And in the end, that is why so many ghost ship stories came from the Great Lakes. Not because these waters are cursed or haunted, but because they are perfectly designed to create the illusion of haunting, to generate experiences that feel extraordinary, to produce sightings that challenge explanation. The Great Lakes are ghost ship factories, producing these stories through the reliable operation of physical and psychological principles, generating experiences that become narratives that persist across time. The sailor on deck in 1902 who saw the schooner appear and vanish was not seeing a ghost. He was seeing the Great Lakes operating as the Great Lakes operate, producing one more in an endless series of ambiguous experiences that would be interpreted through the available cultural framework and would become one more thread in the vast web of stories that make these waters legendary. The ships are still there, in the fog, in the darkness, in the uncertain space between what eyes report and what minds construct. They sail on because the conditions that create them sail on, because the Great Lakes remain themselves, cold and vast and capable of tricks that fool even those who know them best. And that is enough. That is the answer. The ghost ships came from the Great Lakes because the Great Lakes made them, through weather and water and the simple, reliable fact of human perception, completing patterns in darkness, forever.